Rain blew hard against the small windows of Frank Morrison's house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. The calendar on the kitchen wall said March, but the night felt like the dead of winter. Frank had finished washing his mug and was drying it with the old dish towel when a frantic knocking shook the front door. It was not the careful tap of a neighbor or the polite knock of a delivery driver. It was desperate, uneven, and loud, the kind of sound that pulls an old memory out of a man before he can stop it. Frank set the mug down and walked to the entryway. He could hear the wind pulling at the eaves and the soft rattle of the porch light. When he opened the door, the porch was a silver sheet of rain. A man stood there, soaked through, water running off his hair and jacket and pooling on the welcome mat. He held one small suitcase the way a tired traveler holds the last thing he owns. For a moment Frank saw not a man but a boy, the boy he had once tucked into bed after long shifts and hot summers. Then the porch light steadied, and he recognized his son. Marcus looked older than 35. His clothes were good but rumpled. The shine of his shoes had been erased by the rain. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Dad, I lost everything. My house, my business, my marriage. I have nowhere to go." Frank felt something move in his chest, a slow ache that had been there for years. He stepped aside and let his son in. The warm air met the cold, damp night, and a small cloud rose from Marcus's shoulders. Frank locked the door and handed him a towel from the hallway cabinet. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood. The kitchen light cast a soft circle on the table where Frank had eaten alone for a long time. "Sit down, son," Frank said. "Let me make coffee." Marcus nodded and shivered. He put the suitcase by the door and stood awkwardly for a moment, as if he did not know where to put his hands in his father's house. Frank filled the kettle, set 2 mugs on the counter, and listened to the burner hum to life. He had imagined this moment many times, though never quite like this. In those private imaginings, Marcus would arrive with his wife Sarah and the children, a surprise visit, laughter in the doorway, a quick hug before stories began. Instead, there was a wet suitcase and eyes rimmed with red. When the coffee was ready, Frank set a mug in front of his son and sat across from him. Rain tapped on the window above the sink. The little clock on the wall marked the quiet seconds. "Tell me what happened," Frank said. The words came in pieces. A client had refused to pay on a large contract. Other clients had demanded refunds. Debts that once seemed far away arrived all at once. The bank had taken the house. Sarah had taken the children to her parents in California. Friends who had once returned calls in minutes now sent polite messages that said they would be in touch. The truck from the office had been picked up. The accounts were empty. The last week had been nights in the car and showers at a gym he could still access with a pass that had not yet been canceled. "I kept telling myself it would turn around," Marcus said. "I thought I could fix it with one more deal. I thought the next call would save me." He stared into the steam rising from the mug and went quiet. Frank listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that a man in pain does not need a speech to begin with. He needs to be heard. The kitchen was warm and simple. A faded photo of Frank's late wife rested in a frame near the fruit bowl. The porch light flickered and steadied again. "How much do you owe?" Frank asked. Marcus swallowed. 200,000. Frank let the number settle in the room. He thought about the years that number represented in the tight budget of an old tradesman. He thought about evenings spent hunched over forms and early mornings in cold garages. He did not let the thought harden his face. "Where are you staying?" Frank asked. "In the car." Marcus looked down. 3 nights. Frank nodded. "You can sleep in your old room tonight," he said. "We will talk in the morning." The relief that passed across Marcus's face was quick and raw. He reached for the mug as if the warmth could reach his bones. A little color returned to his cheeks. For a few minutes they spoke quietly about the children. Emma was 8 and loved to draw. Tyler had learned to ride a bike without training wheels. Frank listened and asked simple questions. He stored every detail as if it were a small treasure. Then Marcus lifted his eyes, and the old confidence returned, thin but still there. "Dad, I need you to loan me the money. Just enough to pay off the debts and restart. I can rebuild. You know I'm good for it." The words were familiar. They had walked this road before, only now the stakes were higher and the ground was washed out by the storm. Frank watched his son carefully. He saw the fear, but he also saw the reflex that had guided Marcus for years. The reflex that said problems could be erased if a man could just find a big enough check. Frank folded his hands on the table. "Son, I do not have 200,000 to give you," he said. "And even if I did, a check would not fix what needs fixing." Marcus bristled, then slumped. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "I will pay you back. I swear it. I will get another contract. I will make it right." Frank kept his voice gentle. The kettle clicked as the last of the heat faded. The rain softened against the glass. He looked at the lines in his son's face and felt both the weight of the years and the stubborn hope that had kept him going through harder seasons than this. "You are safe here tonight," Frank said. "In the morning, we will begin to figure things out. We will not talk about contracts or investors. We will talk about work. Real work." Marcus stared at him, confused. "Work," he said, as if the word had become foreign. Frank stood and walked to the hallway. He brought back a folded blanket and set it on the chair next to the old sofa. He turned down the thermostat a little, a habit he never shook even in retirement. Then he faced his son squarely, not unkind, but with the steady strength that had built a life out of long days and honest effort. Marcus took a breath, as if to protest. The words died in his throat when he saw that his father would not be moved by pleading or promises or the old glitter of easy solutions. Something else would be required here, something he had not needed in a very long time. Frank nodded toward the dark hallway where the spare room waited, clean sheets already on the bed. He let a beat of silence pass, the kind of silence that turns into a decision. "I will not give you money, but I will help you." The morning in Columbus broke with a pale mist that clung to the narrow street where Frank Morrison lived. The air was still cold, though the storm of the night before had eased. Frank was awake before the sun had fully risen, dressed in his work clothes, the same sturdy jeans and heavy boots he had worn for decades. He moved with a steady rhythm, filling a thermos with coffee, packing a simple lunch into a brown paper bag, and slipping a pencil into his shirt pocket. At exactly 5:30, he pushed open the door to the spare room where Marcus lay tangled in the sheets. "Get up, son," Frank said quietly but firmly. "We are going to work." Marcus groaned and pulled the blanket over his head. The air still smelled faintly of rain, and the thin mattress offered no comfort. "Work? At this hour?" he muttered. Frank switched on the light. The old lamp filled the room with a yellow glow. "Yes, work. You said you wanted a way forward. This is where it begins." By 6, Marcus found himself in the passenger seat of a faded blue Ford F-150. The bench seat was cracked, the heater took too long to warm, and the radio played only static before Frank finally switched it off. Marcus sat stiffly, wearing clothes borrowed from his father. Plain jeans, a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of detergent and the years it had hung in the closet. He looked out the window at the damp streets of Columbus, feeling as if the world had shrunk around him. "Dad," he said after a long silence, "this is not what I had in mind." Frank kept his eyes on the road. "That is because your mind has been chasing numbers instead of truth. Just wait." They pulled into the wide parking lot of Home Depot. Rows of trucks and vans sat in the early light, men in work boots and women in heavy coats, walking quickly through the doors with lists and coffee cups. Frank strode inside with the confidence of someone who knew the aisles like old friends. He greeted the man at the paint counter, called the cashier by her first name, and checked the price tags with the precision of long habit. Marcus followed behind, his pride chafed raw by the ordinariness of it all. He remembered sleek offices in California, glossy conference tables, and catered lunches. Now he trailed his father through aisles of duct tape and copper fittings. Frank loaded a cart with coils of wire, filters, and a new wrench. He stopped once to explain the difference between two brands of sealant, though Marcus only half listened. At the register, Frank paid cash and tucked the receipt carefully into a small notebook. By 7:30, they were pulling into the driveway of a modest one-story house with peeling paint on the shutters. An elderly woman waved from the porch. "Mrs. Patterson," Frank called out with a warm smile, "we are here to fix that air unit." The woman's face lit with relief. "Thank you, Frank. It has been blowing nothing but warm air since last week, and the nights are too cold for me." Frank set to work at once, lifting the toolbox from the truck and kneeling by the outdoor unit. Marcus hovered uncertainly, watching his father test wires and adjust screws with practiced ease. The morning air smelled faintly of cut grass and damp earth. "Hold this," Frank said, handing Marcus a flashlight. "Keep it steady." Marcus crouched beside him, the beam trembling in his hands. He felt clumsy, out of place, reduced from entrepreneur to apprentice. Sweat formed on his forehead even in the cold air. But as he held the light, he noticed something unexpected. His father moved with a surety that spoke of decades of knowledge. There was nothing small about it. Within an hour, the unit hummed to life, sending cool air through the vents inside the house. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands in gratitude. "Oh, bless you, Frank. You saved me. How much do I owe you?" Frank named a fair price, lower than Marcus expected. The woman pressed folded bills into his hand and added a few extra as a tip. She reached for Marcus's hand, too. "Thank you, young man," she said softly. "I could not have managed without you both." The words startled Marcus. He had done so little, only held a flashlight and carried a box of tools. Yet she looked at him with true gratitude. Back in the truck, Frank counted the money. $200. He split the bills cleanly and held out 100 to his son. Marcus frowned. "I did not really do anything." Frank pressed the money into his palm. "You were there. You worked. You earned this." Marcus turned the bill over in his hand, the paper crisp and unexpected. It was nothing like the large transfers and wire deposits he used to manage, numbers that appeared on a screen and vanished again. This was real. It smelled faintly of dust and ink. It carried weight. As they pulled away from Mrs. Patterson's house, Marcus stared at the money for a long time. The truck rattled down the narrow street, sunlight finally breaking through the mist. He felt a tug inside, a small shift he could not yet name. He closed his fist around the bill and whispered almost to himself, "This feels different." By the end of the first week, Marcus had stopped checking his phone every few minutes. The battery sat at half charge all day, then drifted lower as the afternoon wore on, and he hardly noticed. His hands were less clean now. A line of grime lived under his nails, a small badge that soap could not quite defeat. In the mornings, Frank still woke him before sunrise. Coffee went into the thermos. Tools clinked into the metal box. The faded blue Ford rumbled to life and rolled through quiet streets to whatever house needed them next. Marcus still felt a sting when neighbors waved at the truck and recognized his father with easy respect. That sting softened each time he watched a problem yield to patience and skill. The call came on a cold morning when a light frost turned lawns silver. A soft voice on the line said her husband's heat would not hold through the night. They drove to a narrow brick house on the south side where vines curled around a chain-link fence. An older man met them at the door in a flannel robe, breath visible in the air. "I am Mr. Rodriguez," he said. "My wife has arthritis. The cold hurts her joints. I tried space heaters. They tripped the breakers." Frank nodded. No fuss. He listened to the furnace like a doctor listens to a chest. He opened panels and shone a light inside, his movements spare and sure. He showed Marcus a hairline crack in the heat exchanger and explained why it mattered. "When the heat exchanger fails," he said, "the furnace must be replaced." He said it gently, and a shadow passed across Mr. Rodriguez's face. "How much will that cost?" the man asked, already bracing himself. "A new unit would be $4,000 or more," Frank said, and he let the truth sit between them. The house felt smaller. In the front room, a framed wedding photo rested on a shelf, the couple younger and standing under a summer sun. Marcus stared at it, and then at the thin robe and the old slippers on the floor. He looked at his father. Frank did not pack up. He stepped outside and called supply yards he knew by name. He asked about returns, about equipment pulled during renovations, about the one unit that might be solid enough to trust. He kept his voice level and his questions specific. After several tries, he found a furnace 5 years old, clean, and warrantied for a season. $800, he said when he re-entered the house, and $400 for installation. We can do it today. $1,200 total. Mr. Rodriguez blinked twice. The relief in his shoulders looked like a man set down a heavy load. They worked through lunch, careful and steady. Marcus carried sheet metal and held the flashlight again, but now he asked why this bracket mattered, and why that angle made the airflow better. Frank answered without condescension. When the thermostat clicked and warm air pushed through the vents, a soft sound came from the back bedroom. The man's wife appeared in the doorway and clasped her hands to her chest. "Bless you," she said, and then she whispered something to her husband in Spanish that made him nod, eyes damp. Back at the truck, Marcus was quiet. "We could have made more selling a new furnace," he said finally. His tone held curiosity, not argument. "Yes," Frank said, "and we would have lost our soul. A good name is worth more than a fat invoice. We made honest money and kept a family warm. That is the business we are in." The next week brought lower skies and busier phones. A diner off Parsons Avenue called near closing time. The kitchen was dark. The owner met them outside with a face lined by worry. "Power went out in the back 2 days ago," he said. 3 electricians came through. 2 told me to shut the doors until I can afford a full rewire. The third quoted $8,000. I cannot even pay my staff if we stay closed another day. The dining room smelled of coffee and onions from lunch. A waitress wiped a counter with slow circles and watched them pass. In the kitchen, breaker labels were smudged and wires ran like dry riverbeds along the wall. Frank traced the circuits with a pencil and a tester. He moved methodically, a small frown between his eyes. Marcus followed close, handing tools before Frank asked, reading the pattern in the way his father knelt and stood and listened to silence. They found it at last, a relay switch scorched black on one corner. It had been carrying too much load for too long, the kind of mistake that hides until the wrong night exposes it. Frank held it up. "This is your culprit," he said. He sent Marcus to the supply counter 3 blocks away with exact part numbers written in neat block letters. Marcus jogged through the cold, bought the relay for $47, and jogged back feeling younger than he had in years. When the new switch slid into place and the owner threw the breaker, the kitchen woke as if from a coma. The hood roared. The grill hissed. A line of lights flickered on and steadied, spreading warm color across steel and tile. The waitress laughed out loud and clapped her hands. The owner closed his eyes for a long second, then opened the register and pulled out cash. "How much?" he asked, already reaching for more. $200 for the part and labor," Frank said. The owner stared at him, stunned. "The other quotes were $8,000, he said again, as if repeating it would make sense of what had just happened. He pushed $500 across the counter and insisted they come in for dinner for 2 weeks. Frank tried to refuse the meals, but the man would not hear of it. "Let me take care of you the way you took care of me," he said. Marcus felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the grill. They sat on 2 stools at the far end of the counter that evening and ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes that tasted like someone's grandmother had made them. The waitress topped off their coffee without being asked. Marcus watched a couple share a plate and a trucker count bills for a tip. He watched a small economy of kindness pass from hand to hand as quietly as the coffee pot. The work they had done sat in the room like an invisible guest, paid for and still giving. Out in the cold again, Marcus leaned against the truck and let his breath fog the air. "Dad," he said, "we did not just fix a kitchen. We saved his business. That is someone's rent and someone's groceries and someone's reason to get up tomorrow morning." Frank nodded once, proud but not surprised. "Real work ties your hands to other people's lives," he said. "That is why it matters how you do it." Days ran together in a rhythm Marcus began to trust. He stopped flinching at crawl spaces and learned to keep extra batteries in his pocket for the flashlight. He asked better questions and listened longer to the answers. He learned to greet customers by name and to explain a repair in plain words without making a person feel small. He learned that a fair price spoken calmly earns more trust than a slick pitch with a discount at the end. He learned to wipe his boots before stepping onto a kitchen floor and to say thank you when an older woman pressed a tip into his palm because she could not stop herself from showing gratitude. On a quiet afternoon, they drove past a 2-story house with fresh paint and a new fence. Frank pointed with his chin. "Helped build that one 20 years ago," he said. "I drive by and remember which studs I set with my own hands. It is good to leave things behind that stand when you are not there." Marcus looked at the house and then at his father's hands on the wheel, the tendons bowed and strong. He imagined spreadsheets and slide decks and invoices, and he tried to picture them standing in the sun. He could not. Back at the kitchen table that night, counting the day's cash the way farmers count eggs, Marcus felt something settle inside him. The numbers were smaller than the ones he used to chase. They were also solid, tied to faces and doorways and grateful handshakes. He lifted his eyes to his father. "Dad," he said, "I am starting to understand." Frank held his gaze, a quiet smile in the corners of his eyes. "This is only the beginning, son. Are you ready for the real test?" The summer sun settled heavy over Columbus, laying a soft glare across windshields and turning the streets into slow rivers of light. By late afternoon, the day's work had left a fine dust on Marcus's arms and a tired satisfaction in his shoulders. He and Frank had replaced a cracked disposal for a young couple, fixed a thermostat that kept skipping past the set point, and swapped out a ceiling fan that had wobbled like a loose tooth over a kitchen table. They ate turkey sandwiches on the tailgate of the faded blue truck, the paper bags weighted with 2 apples and a handful of napkins. The air smelled like hot sidewalks and cut grass. Marcus checked the clipboard and drew a line through the last work order. For once, the phone stayed quiet. He leaned back against the truck bed and let the stillness settle. Frank sipped from the dented thermos. A lawn sprinkler ticked somewhere nearby, little arcs of water catching the sun. When Marcus's phone finally rang, the name on the screen pulled the day out from under him. David Chen. The old world, 1 call away. He hesitated before answering, then put the phone to his ear. David's voice was bright and familiar, full of the easy confidence Marcus had once carried like a spare suit. "Marcus, I heard you were back at it. We are building out a new office. We need a complete heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, top to bottom. $150,000 on the table, 6 weeks. You are the man who can make it move." Marcus looked at his father. Frank gave a small nod that meant, "Go on, hear him out." The street was quiet. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then fell silent. Heat pressed on the back of Marcus's neck. "Tell me more about the timeline," Marcus said, and the old phrasing returned to his mouth without asking permission. "What are the specs? Who is handling permits? What are your inspection windows? What payment terms are you offering?" David laughed softly. "There is the Marcus I know. We want it fast. We want it clean. We want a single point of contact. Net 30 on invoices. I can send the draft tonight." Marcus had to close his eyes for a second. He could see the clean lines of a glass lobby, taste the catered coffee, feel the smooth weight of a pen he once thought meant he mattered. He could see himself subcontracting most of the work, signing off on progress reports in a pressed shirt while crews sweated under ducts and over ladders. He knew that dance too well. The markup that looked neat on a spreadsheet, the delays you smoothed with confident talk, the meetings that pushed real work off another week. He opened his eyes. The truck was still there, the sun still hot, his father still waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to hear truth under noise. "If I take this," Marcus thought, "I will rent a bigger warehouse. I will hire fast and hope. I will chase inspectors and argue with schedules and run on promises again." He looked down at his forearms, still smudged from the thermostat. He thought of Mrs. Patterson's grateful smile. He thought of Mr. Rodriguez's wife warming her hands near the vent. He thought of the diner kitchen, roaring back to life over a part that cost less than dinner for two. "David," he said slowly, "I remember the way those projects go. There is a lot of shine at the start, and a lot of explaining at the end. 6 weeks sounds like a plan until the second week runs long. Then you need more bodies. Then you give away control to keep the money moving. I used to be very good at that. It did not make me a better man." There was a pause long enough for a car to pass, and for Frank to finish his coffee. Marcus could hear the clink of ice from somewhere unseen. He could imagine David sitting in a bright office chair, frowning as if he were trying to place an unfamiliar song. "Marcus, this is real money," David said. "You said you needed a way back. This is a way back." Marcus looked at the truck bed, at the tools lined in their trays like instruments. He thought of the small stack of envelopes on Frank's kitchen counter, each one with neat handwriting and a check inside from someone who had shaken their hands at a doorway. No chasing, no bluffing, no discounts to soften bad news. He thought of Emma and Tyler, little voices on the phone asking what he had fixed today. "I am not looking for a way back," Marcus said. He could feel his voice steady as he spoke. "I am looking for a way forward." He glanced at Frank, and his father's eyes did not move from his. For the first time, Marcus did not feel the need for approval. He felt the need to tell the truth. David tried again, a little faster, as if speed could make the argument stronger. "We could structure it so you do not touch the heavy lifting. You manage, you bill, you keep your hands clean. That is how leaders operate." Marcus looked at his hands, at the faint line of a scrape across one knuckle, at the crescent of dirt no amount of scrubbing had erased completely. He had once believed clean hands proved worth. Now he saw the mark of empty days in palms that never did a thing you could point to after sunset. He let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. "David, I appreciate you calling me," he said, "truly, but that is not my work anymore." A longer pause came down the line. Finally, David asked, "Then what is, Marcus?" Marcus stood straighter. He felt the heat and the weight of the day and the small, steady pride that had grown like a seed in good soil these past months. He did not dress the words with cleverness. He did not reach for flourish. He spoke like a man who had finally found a voice he did not have to practice. "I am Morrison and Son now," he said. "We do honest work for honest people." Across the tailgate, Frank did not smile big or clap him on the back. He simply put the thermos top down and set it beside the lunch bag, an old man's quiet way of saying he had heard and believed. On the other end of the line, David exhaled sharply, somewhere between surprise and dismissal. "If you change your mind," David said, "there will not be many chances like this." "There do not need to be," Marcus said, and he ended the call gently, without anger. The street returned. The sprinkler still ticked, stitching water along the edge of a dry lawn. A child pedaled past on a small bike with streamers on the handlebars. The world did not applaud. It simply went on, and that, Marcus realized, was part of the grace of it. Frank closed the truck's tailgate and slid the thermos into place. They rode in an easy quiet to a late afternoon appointment to tighten a loose railing on a front porch. The house belonged to a retired nurse who had made her own coffee cake and insisted they take 2 slices home. Marcus drove the screws in carefully and checked the posts twice. When the railing held firm under Frank's testing weight, the nurse nodded, satisfied. She pressed a few extra dollars into Marcus's hand and told him to say hello to his father for her, though Frank was standing right there. Marcus laughed with her, not at her, feeling how kindness felt when it landed without suspicion. On the way home, the sun slid lower and softened. The city wore that forgiving light that makes even faded paint look warm. Marcus turned onto their street and parked in front of the small house that had become a kind of anchor. They carried the day's small treasures inside, the leftover coffee cake wrapped in waxed paper, the cash folded neatly, the knowledge that the last job had been done right. At the kitchen table, Frank counted the bills and recorded the work in his small notebook. Marcus watched the ritual, feeling again how solid a day could be when it had shape and purpose. He rinsed 2 plates, set out forks, and poured milk into 2 glasses because that is what the cake asked for. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds a home together instead of letting it fall apart. Frank looked up at him across the table. Pride was there, but so was something else. A faint light behind his eyes that Marcus had not noticed before, like a story waiting on the porch step. "Any regrets?" Frank asked, not to test, but to invite. Marcus shook his head. 6 months ago, I would have chased it. I would have hired a dozen strangers, promised the moon, and found a way to make a late job look on time. Tonight, I would rather tighten a railing and eat cake. Frank's laugh was soft and brief. He set the notebook aside and broke the cake in half with a fork. For a while, they ate in companionable silence. The air smelled like cinnamon and coffee. A neighborhood dog barked at nothing. A car door closed and then opened again. When the plates were empty, Frank wiped a crumb with his finger and looked at his son with a careful gentleness. He seemed to weigh something in his mind, then set the thought down where Marcus could see it. "There's something you still don't know, son." The next morning dawned clear and quiet, a thin veil of mist still clinging to the grass. Marcus woke to the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway and the sound of his father moving around the kitchen. The night before, Frank had left him with a sentence that echoed in his mind even as he slept. "There's something you still don't know, son." Marcus dressed and walked into the kitchen. Frank was already at the table, the small ledger book open in front of him, a pencil resting across its spine. The pages were filled with neat columns of numbers, job notes, and names written carefully as if each one mattered. Frank looked up. "Morning," he said simply. "Sit down." Marcus poured himself coffee, black and strong, and sat across from his father. For a few minutes, they ate toast in silence. Then Frank closed the ledger, folded his hands, and looked Marcus in the eye. "You asked me for money the night you came back," Frank said. "I told you I could not give it to you. That was not the full truth." Marcus frowned, unsure what to make of the words. "I have money," Frank continued. "More than you think." The room felt smaller suddenly, the ticking of the clock louder. Marcus set his coffee down carefully. "How much, Dad?" Frank leaned back, his gaze steady. $300,000. Marcus stared, certain he had misheard. 300,000. His father, who drove a battered Ford and counted every grocery receipt, who patched his own roof with tar when shingles were on sale, was saying he had a small fortune tucked away. "Where?" Marcus asked, his voice sharper than he meant. "Savings. Investments. Jobs I took where I charged fair, but put aside the extra. I never lived above my means. I kept working after I could have retired. Every year I put a little away. It adds up when you are not trying to look rich." Marcus felt a rush of heat in his chest. He thought of the nights in his car, the desperate calls, the humiliation of asking for help. All the while, his father had this safety net. "You could have saved me," Marcus said, the words tumbling out rough. "You could have written one check, and none of this, none of it, had to happen." Frank's voice stayed calm. "If I had written that check, what would you have learned? That you can gamble and lose and someone else will bail you out. That you can ignore the truth and hide behind money." Marcus pushed his chair back, stood, and paced the small kitchen. He wanted to shout. He wanted to accuse. But behind the anger was something else. Shame. Because even now, hearing the number, part of him wanted that check. Part of him still believed a sudden windfall could patch the cracks. Frank waited, patient, letting the storm move. Finally, when Marcus turned back, Frank spoke again. "You think I did nothing when I watched you fall, but I gave you the only thing that matters, the chance to find out who you are without shortcuts." Marcus sank back into his chair. His hands trembled. He thought of the first $100 from Mrs. Patterson, folded into his palm. He thought of Mr. Rodriguez's grateful wife, the diner owner pressing money into Frank's hand with tears in his eyes. He thought of the call from David, the chance at big money, and how he had turned it down because it felt hollow. Frank leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Money cannot rebuild a man. Work can. Honesty can. Facing yourself can. That is why I never told you. For the first time, Marcus saw his father not as the man in worn jeans and old boots, but as someone who had carried wisdom like a hidden well, waiting for the day his son was thirsty enough to drink from it. He swallowed hard. Dad, I do not know whether to be furious or grateful. You do not have to decide tonight, Frank said. Just understand. I trusted you enough to let you break, because I knew you could rise again. Silence filled the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove past outside. Marcus stared at his father, the weight of $300,000 hovering between them, not as money, but as a truth too large to ignore. He looked down at his hands, rougher now, stronger. For the first time in years, he did not feel small in his father's presence. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something vast and unfinished. Frank reached across the table and placed his hand over Marcus's. The touch was steady, unshaking. Son, this is not about dollars. This is about what kind of man you choose to be. Marcus's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words caught. He thought of Sarah, of Emma and Tyler, of the life that had crumbled and the pieces he wanted to rebuild. He thought of the work he had begun to understand, the dignity of it, the way it tethered him to others in a way that boardrooms never had. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Then I have to choose. Frank nodded slowly. Yes, and the choice is coming sooner than you think. Marcus looked at his father, the coffee cooling between them, the ledger closed, the morning light stretching across the table. For the first time, he understood that the real test was not in the jobs they had done, but in the decision waiting just ahead. And he knew, though he could not yet see how, that everything in his life would turn on what he chose next. Spring laid a clean light over Columbus, the kind that makes porches look freshly painted and turns the ordinary into something to be grateful for. Sarah and the children arrived on a mild Saturday, the kind of day that invites doors to stay propped open. Emma ran up the front walk with a backpack bouncing behind her, and Tyler followed with a baseball glove on his hand. Frank stood on the porch, careful not to make a fuss, and Marcus met them halfway down the steps. The first embrace was a quiet one, the kind that builds from relief rather than fanfare. In the kitchen, Sarah set a small casserole on the counter and glanced around with the cautious hope of someone stepping onto a bridge that had once been unsteady. She thanked Frank for the room he had kept ready and for something larger she could not yet name. That afternoon, the house filled with small noises that had been missing for too long, the scrape of chair legs, the slap of a screen door, the irregular laughter of children who now had more to laugh about. They did not wake up rich, but they woke up sure. Marcus and Sarah rented a modest 2-bedroom house 10 minutes away, close enough for the children to ride their bikes to Grandpa Frank's on a Saturday. Sarah took a position as a substitute teacher at the elementary school, where the hallway walls were covered in crayon rockets and paper owls. Marcus and Frank kept the business simple. They returned calls, they showed up on time, they did the work right the first time, and they priced the work like they were talking to family. On a Wednesday morning, they interviewed Tommy Gonzalez, an electrician with steady hands and a resume full of large projects that had ended without thanks. On Friday, they brought on Miguel Santos, a plumber who could read a house the way some men read a map. Frank looked each man in the eye and said what he told every customer and now told every employee. We are here to solve problems honestly. We are here to leave a place better than we found it. Do that, and the rest will follow. Word traveled in the ways that matter most, from a front porch to a church pew, across a diner counter where a waitress tucked a pencil behind her ear and said, "You should call those fellows I told you about." The restaurant owner from the dark kitchen sent them 3 more jobs and insisted they eat at his place whenever they finished nearby. The older man whose furnace had breathed warm air into his wife's room sent a note with careful penmanship that said the house felt alive again. A pastor stopped Frank in the parking lot after a Sunday service and thanked him for how he had treated a family on a fixed income, and Frank nodded, embarrassed by praise he did not need. Emma started spending Saturdays at the house, learning to set a flashlight steady and to label small drawers of screws and wire nuts with neat block letters. Tyler learned to hold a level against a stud and wait for the bubble to find the center. Frank's hands were patient with them, and Marcus's voice surprised even himself by staying gentle when the wrench slipped or the wire cap fell. The children drew a sign on a scrap of plywood that read Morrison and Son, and they painted a small sun with bright rays on the corner because the spelling had made them smile. Money steadied. It did not surge the way it once had. It gathered itself in tidy stacks of envelopes on the kitchen counter and in careful lines in the ledger. When a month closed, they counted honestly what was left after they paid Tommy and Miguel, after they bought filters and elbows and wire, after they set aside taxes and a small cushion. Marcus watched the numbers and did not feel the old hunger to inflate them. He felt instead a quiet pride in numbers that could be explained without a single excuse. He took the children for ice cream and told them exactly how many jobs it took to make a week work. He showed Emma how to spin a crescent wrench down a bolt without stripping it and told Tyler why a breaker should never be oversized to force a problem quiet. He told them that work has a voice, and if you listen, it will tell you what is right. Late in the spring, Marcus sat with Frank under the maple tree in the yard and spoke plainly about the folder of statements that had once felt like a thunderclap. He said he understood now why the money had stayed put and why the lesson had not. He thanked his father without ceremony, the way working men thank each other when the job is done well. Frank accepted the thanks and said only that a father's job is not to keep a son from every fall, but to teach him how to stand back up and keep his dignity. They fell into a comfortable silence and watched Tyler throw a baseball against the side of the garage and catch it on the rebound. The rhythm of it was the kind of sound a home makes when it is finally itself again. By early summer, the little company owned a second ladder and a better saw, not because someone had impressed them in a showroom, but because the old tools had started to ask for a rest. They bought a used hand dryer for the shop sink and laughed about the luxury. They kept the Ford because it ran and because it felt like part of the family. On a hot Saturday, Sarah brought lemonade in a glass pitcher that sweated on the picnic table, while Emma asked if she could learn to replace a light switch. Frank nodded and guided her small hands, explaining each step until the lamp turned on without a flicker. Marcus watched his daughter's face change from concentration to glad surprise, and he felt something in his chest that felt like a door closing gently on an old room. Later, they drove to the Little League field, where Tyler's team played on sun-baked dirt, and Marcus stood at the chain-link fence and did not check his phone once. The community learned what to expect from them. Customers did not call for the cheapest price in town. They called when they wanted a job done correctly by people who would show their work and stand behind it. When a mistake happened, and it did once in a while, Marcus drove back without charge and fixed it without bluster. He discovered that the words, "I am sorry, let me make it right," had more power than any contract he had ever written. He discovered, too, that he liked coming home tired, the kind of tired that comes from walking up 3 flights of stairs with a coil of wire on your shoulder and coming back down without it because you solved something real. At night, he and Sarah sat on the small couch after the children were asleep and talked about ordinary things, and the ordinary felt like a gift. One evening, after they had eaten dinner at the old oak table and washed the plates until they squeaked, Emma looked at Frank with the seriousness that 9 years old can carry. "Grandpa, why is Daddy happier now than before?" Frank set his fork down and waited a beat. Because some truths deserve a small silence before they are spoken. Because now he knows real success is not about what you have, but who you are. Emma nodded slowly, as if she were putting a book back on a shelf where it belonged, and Tyler, who had been listening without seeming to, smiled and asked if they could all go out to the garage and see what tools needed cleaning before Saturday. There was no parade for this new life. There were no headlines. There was the steadiness of mornings, and the gentleness of good work, and the reliable comfort of being known. The ledger on the table gathered new pages. The sun on the porch found different angles as the year turned. The phone rang with neighbors, and then rang with friends of neighbors. When fall came, the maples reddened and let go of their leaves one by one, the way a man lets go of the things he no longer needs. On a bright morning that smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh coffee, Frank stood in the doorway with a small smile and watched his son step into the driveway. The old ladder gleamed from a recent scrubbing. The toolbox hinges moved without squeak. The sky was a high blue that promised good weather. Marcus lifted the first bundle of tools and set them in the bed of the old Ford. He moved easily, the motion of a man who liked the weight of what he carried. He checked the straps, tightened a tie, and reached for the next coil of wire. He did not hurry. He did not posture. He simply prepared to go help someone who needed him. The story closed with the image of Marcus loading tools into the old Ford F-150, this time with a willing smile. On quiet evenings when the tools were put away and the porch light glowed softly across the yard, the little house seemed to hold more than just a family. It carried the echo of mistakes made, lessons learned, and a foundation rebuilt with care. What began as a man returning home in shame ended as 3 generations finding their strength side by side, bound not by wealth or appearances, but by steady work, forgiveness, and love. The heart of this story rests in a truth many of us have known in our own way. Dignity is not something bought or borrowed. It is something lived. To rise after being cast aside, to stand calmly for honesty and compassion, is to build a life that no failure can undo. Like a porch light left burning for a traveler in the night, even the smallest acts of kindness and integrity can guide us safely through the darkest roads. Perhaps that is the lesson worth carrying long after the last page closes. Do not rush to measure another by the surface of their clothes, their mistakes, or the quietness of their presence. Justice and truth often arrive from the very place we least expected, from the person the world dismissed too quickly. And when they arrive, they do not roar. They steady us, they heal us, and they remind us of what truly endures. So take a moment to sit with this story and ask where it touches your own journey. If it has stirred something gentle in you, consider sharing that warmth with someone who might be waiting for light on their own dark road. For in the end, it is not the grand gestures that bind us together, but the simple, steady glow of lives lived with quiet honor.